Do you remember the sound a dial-up modem made the first time you connected? That grinding, screeching handshake between your world and something new. Something vast and unknowable and arriving all at once. You were maybe 17, maybe 22. Old enough to remember the silence before it. Young enough to step through without hesitation. That sound, that specific sound, is stored somewhere in the architecture of your memory, right next to the smell of a video rental store on a Friday evening, the weight of a cordless phone with its long antenna, the specific satisfaction of rewinding a tape all the way to the beginning. Both live in you, the analog and the digital, the before and the after. And the fact that you hold both, that you remember life before the internet and watched it arrive, is not a coincidence. It is the defining psychological fact of who you are. But here's the part no one talks about. Most people assume generational identity is simply about the year you were born, that it's trivia, a label for marketing reports. What researchers are beginning to understand, though, is that the timing of your formative years against the backdrop of technological and cultural change shapes not just your memories, but the actual structure of how you think, how you handle uncertainty, how you form identity, how you tolerate being between things. And if you were born somewhere between 1976 and 1985, you didn't just grow up in an interesting era. You grew up at the precise hinge point where one version of human civilization quietly closed and another began loading. You are a Xennial. And once you understand what that actually means, a great many things about yourself will finally make sense. Before algorithms learned your preferences, boredom was the landscape you crossed every single day. Long afternoons with nothing scheduled, nothing streaming, nothing glowing in your hand. Saturdays that stretched out like open fields. If you wanted entertainment, you had to invent it. If you wanted connection, you had to physically go somewhere and find it. Psychologists call what emerged from that kind of childhood the default mode network. The cognitive system that activates when external stimulation disappears and the mind turns inward. When you wander, when you recombine, when you create from nothing. For your generation, that wasn't a meditation practice. That was Tuesday afternoon. You built entire worlds from spare materials. You ran elaborate games with no instructions, no screens, no referee. You learned without anyone explaining it to you that imagination was a renewable resource that expanded the more you used it. And then something shifted. You also learned to wait. You waited for photos to be developed, sometimes a week after the moment passed. And when the prints finally came back, you held them in your hands and looked at them, in a way people rarely look at photographs anymore. You waited for a song to come on the radio, and when it did, you ran across the room to hit record. You waited at agreed meeting spots because once you left the house, you were genuinely unreachable. No text, no location pin, just a time in a corner and the expectation that both parties would hold to it. That waiting wasn't frustrating, it was simply the texture of time. And in that texture, something formed in you that researchers now study with genuine fascination. The psychological muscle of delayed gratification, the tolerance for uncertainty, the quiet understanding that not everything worth having arrives on demand. These are not small things. These are the foundations of resilience. They are the reason you can sit with a difficult problem longer than most. The reason chaos doesn't unravel you the way it unravels people who never had to wait for anything. Your social world was unmediated. Completely, entirely, physically unmediated. Conflict happened in front of you, in real time, with no delete button, no screenshot, no ability to craft your response over several minutes while you figured out exactly what to say. You had to read faces. You had to hear the tone behind the words. You had to understand the weight of silence and the meaning of posture before you had any language for those things. Emotional intelligence wasn't a buzzword in your childhood. It was simply how you survived. You learned repair. When you fell out with a friend, you couldn't just unfollow them and never think about it again. They were in your class. They lived 3 streets over. The discomfort of the rift lived in the same physical space as you, which meant you had to walk through it, not around it. You learned that friction was survivable, that relationships could bend without breaking, that the person you argued with on Thursday could be the person you rode bikes with on Saturday, and that neither event had to erase the other. This is not a small psychological gift. There is research, serious peer-reviewed research, suggesting that the generation raised before social media developed stronger conflict resolution skills, higher emotional tolerance, and a measurably different relationship with discomfort than those who grew up with the option to simply exit difficult social situations. You didn't have the exit, you learned to stay, and the capacity to stay, to endure, to repair. That is threaded into you now at a level so deep you probably don't even recognize it as a skill. You just think it's normal. It is not normal. It is rare. Now here is where your story becomes genuinely unusual. Because unlike every generation before you, you didn't simply grow up in one world and stay in it. You grew up in one world, adapted to an entirely different one, and then had to hold both simultaneously for the rest of your life. You entered your teens or your 20s, and the internet arrived. Not slowly, not gently. It arrived like a door swinging open onto an entirely different landscape. Email appeared, then instant messaging, then websites that let you say things to hundreds of people at once, then social media, then smartphones, then the collapse of every boundary between the private and the public, the local and the global, the real and the performed. Each of these transitions happened, from a historical standpoint, in almost no time at all. And here is what that did to you psychologically. Most people go through what developmental theorists call identity consolidation, the process by which, in your late teens and early 20s, you settle into a stable sense of who you are in relation to the world around you, the culture you belong to, the way time works, the rules of communication, the texture of daily life. Identity consolidates around context, around a stable enough set of conditions that you can locate yourself within them. Your context changed completely, twice. Once in childhood when the world was physical and slow and local and patient, and again in adulthood when it became digital and fast and global and immediate. You had to reconsolidate. You had to rebuild your sense of self around an entirely new set of conditions, while also carrying the psychological imprint of the first world you'd learned. Researchers at the University of Melbourne noted that this specific experience, growing up analog and entering adulthood digital, created a micro-generation with what they described as genuinely unusual adaptability. Not just technical adaptability, cognitive adaptability. The ability to hold two operating systems in your mind at the same time and switch between them fluidly. You are bilingual in a way that has no name yet. You speak analog and digital. You speak patience and urgency. You speak depth and speed, and you move between them so naturally that you've probably never noticed you're doing it. But there is a cost. And without understanding the cost, you can't fully understand why you sometimes feel the way you do. Identity, psychologically speaking, is not just about knowing who you are. It is about the felt sense of belonging to something. To a culture, a generation, a story. That belonging provides a kind of quiet stability, a background certainty that you are located, that you fit, that you are legible to the people around you. And for most of your life, you have existed at the edges of two different belonging structures, never entirely claimed by either. Too young for the full weight of Gen X cynicism, that hard-won analog independence, the deliberate distance from institutions, but too anchored in the physical world to fully inhabit the millennial experience, which formed inside the architecture of the internet from the beginning. Millennials grew up with the internet as the water they swam in. For you, it was something you arrived at, something you adopted, which means part of you will always have a memory of before. That sliver of difference is enormous. It means that you experience the modern world with a kind of double vision that most people around you simply don't have. When a millennial colleague talks about building their personal brand, you understand the concept and you can execute it. But somewhere beneath the execution, a quieter part of you remembers when the idea of packaging yourself for public consumption would have sounded like science fiction. You participate fully in the present, and you carry the memory of what preceded it, both simultaneously, always. That is not confusion. That is not failure to commit. That is the specific psychological weight of being born at the hinge point of history. There is something else. Something that runs even deeper than generational technology. You were raised during what many developmental psychologists would later call the last era of low-surveillance childhood. Children in the late 70s and early 80s were, by modern standards, astonishingly free. You roamed. You disappeared for hours. You navigated social situations without adult presence, made decisions without adult oversight, resolved conflicts and made mistakes, and climbed things you weren't supposed to climb, all without anyone watching. This kind of unstructured, unsupervised experience is now understood to be profoundly important for the development of what psychologists call executive function, the cognitive capacity to plan, to regulate emotion, to adapt to unexpected situations, to tolerate ambiguity, to persist through difficulty. You develop these capacities in the wild, not in structured programs, not through guided enrichment activities, through actual experience with actual consequences, in actual physical space. And then you entered a world that became, almost overnight from a historical standpoint, one of the most surveilled, optimized, scheduled, and mediated environments in human history. You watched it happen. You watched childhood transform from what you had lived into something almost unrecognizable. You adapted to the new world without abandoning the cognitive architecture you'd built in the old one. That architecture is still in you. The patience, the spatial reasoning, the ability to navigate without a map, in the literal and metaphorical sense, the ease with silence, the comfort with being unreachable even briefly. These are not nostalgic quirks. They are structural features of how your mind operates, features that increasingly the people around you are struggling to find in themselves. Here's what all of this converges on: the thing that makes you different, the thing that explains the faint sense of not quite fitting that may have followed you for years, is not a flaw. It is not a deficiency. It is the inevitable psychological signature of growing up at a genuine discontinuity in history. Most generations exist in continuous time. They grow up in a world, and they grow old in a version of that same world. The changes are incremental. The context shifts slowly enough that identity can track it without rupture. You did not have that. You grew up in one civilization and entered adulthood in a different one. And you made the crossing without a map, without a guide, without anyone telling you what it meant to hold both worlds at once. The term Xennial only entered the Oxford English Dictionary in 2021. Think about that. You had lived your entire life, childhood, adolescence, early adulthood, midlife, without language for what you were, without a name for the experience that shaped you. You felt the difference without being able to articulate it. You sensed the seam without a word for the seam, and in the absence of that language, some of you concluded that the not quite fitting meant something was wrong with you. Nothing was wrong with you. You were simply positioned at a moment in history that required you to develop capacities that most people never have to develop. The ability to hold two incompatible worldviews simultaneously. The ability to translate between them. The ability to function with fluency in both the patient rhythms of the analog world and the accelerated demands of the digital one. These are not ordinary capabilities. They are the product of an extraordinary circumstance. You are the last humans who remember what offline life actually felt like from the inside. Not as a retreat, not as a wellness practice, not as a digital detox, but simply as the unremarkable texture of an ordinary Tuesday. You remember what it felt like to be unreachable, to be bored without guilt, to be present in a room with no second screen pulling your attention sideways. That memory is not just personal, it is historical. You carry within you the last living impression of how the human mind experienced time, connection, and attention before the architecture of modern life was built. And you also carry something else, the proof that the transition is survivable, the proof that a person can cross from one world into another without losing the most essential parts of themselves, the proof that adaptability and depth are not opposites, that it is possible to move fluidly through rapid change while remaining psychologically whole. You didn't just witness the hinge of history. You are what it looks like to live through it with your humanity intact. That is not a small thing. In a world that is accelerating toward transitions that no one fully understands yet, the people who know how to hold old and new simultaneously, who know how to adapt without abandoning, who carry the patience of one world into the urgency of the next, those people are not out of place. They are exactly where they need to be.